Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Beis, and in Eretz Hashem, we will be learning today the rest of Daf Nun Daled Amud Aleph, and I hope a nice piece of Nun Daled Amud Beis as well. I think my voice is a little bit better than it was yesterday. Before we begin, the learning today should be a schus refuah shalema for Meir ben Chayes Sarah, who's in need of Rachimei Shamayim. Also, the Torah that we learn should be a schus for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael, Hanesunim Batzaru Bashivya, wherever they may be. Certainly, all of the Yidden in Eretz Yisroel, certainly the boots on the ground in Eretz Yisroel, the soldiers that are putting themselves in harm's way to protect the rest of Eretz Yisroel. Certainly, we know that the ultimate protection for Eretz Yisroel comes from Avinu Shabashamayim. We asked the Rebbeinu Shalom, the Rebbeinu Shalom should have Rachmanus, the Rebbeinu Shalom should protect Eretz Yisrael, the Rebbeinu Shalom should protect all Yidden B'chal Makom Shehem, and what we're seeing now should Mirza Hashem be a calling sign of the coming of the Geula Shlema, which is really what we want. We don't want just a Yeshua from this tzara, we want a Yeshua from all the tzaras of Klal Yisrael, the Dairei Dairais. What we really mispal for is we asked the Rebbeinu Shalom to finally bring the Geula Shlema. So, we pick up today on Nun Daled Amud Aleph. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Netillas Yadayim. We're in Siman Kuf Samach in middle of Sif Yud Aleph. And we find ourselves the third line down in the Shulchan Aruch on Nun Daled Amud Aleph, right by the Eis Kat Nun Aleph for the Mishnah Berurah, by the words V'yesh mi she'omer. So here, in the beginning of Sif Yud Aleph, the Mechaber told us a fascinating halacha. Basically, the Mechaber told us that since the Netillas Yadayim is a din derabanan, sveika lekula. So, if we have a suffix whether or not the mayim that we want to use for the Netillas Yadayim is mayim that's really kosher for the Netillas Yadayim or not. So, for example, we have water sitting in a basin, and we would like to use that water for Netillas Yadayim, but we have a suffix. It's possible that this water was used for some kind of malacha, or it could be that it was not used for any kind of malacha. Somebody filled up a basin and left it next to the sink. If it's mayim shenasa behen malacha, if somebody performed a task with this water, let's say somebody used it to soak lettuce before he wanted to check the lettuce for bugs, or somebody washed a dish in the water. In that case, it would be Ma'im Shenasa Behem Malacha, and it would be puzzle for the Netillas Yadayim because it would be considered Ma'im Shofchim, it would be considered wastewater. But it's possible that somebody filled up this basin and left it there, and it's perfectly kosher for the Netillas Yadayim. So we have a suffix. Or, let's say we have a suffix, we have water that has salt in it, but we're not exactly an expert on kalavim, on dogs, and we don't know, is this water that's roi l'shtias kelev, or is it not water that's roi l'shtias kelev? So here, we have a suffix whether or not the water is usable for the Netillas Yadayim. We also could have a suffix on the status of our hands. Maybe somebody is unsure whether or not he washed the Netillas Yadayim. He certainly meant to wash the Netillas Yadayim. Then he got interrupted. He got distracted. He's not sure, did he wash the Netillas Yadayim or not? So now it's a suffix on the status of the hands. Are the hands tamei or are the hands tar? In all of these cases, the Mechaber told us that we could go lekula and we could make an assumption of tahara. We could assume that the hands are tahar. We could assume that the water is kosher for the Netillas Yadayim. And in the words of the Ramah, on the second line down here in the Daled Amud Aleph, v'chol suffix tahara b'yadayim tahar. Whenever it comes to a suffix in the Netillas Yadayim, any kind of suffix, we could always go lekula. Now we go to the third line down where the Mechaber says, however, v'yesh bi shaimer, he brings down the Shitas Harayvid. V'yesh bi shaimer, there is one who says, she'im kol zois, despite everything that we've said here in the beginning of Sif Yud Aleph, where we said that you could go lekula by a suffix, im yesh lo mayim acherim, if somebody has other water that's available to him for the Netillas Yadayim. So yes, there's a basin of seemingly clean water sitting next to the sink, and since I have a suffix, technically I could use that water. but I can also turn on the faucet and fill up a new keli of water. So says the Ravid, the Mechaber brings down, if you have other water available to you, yital yadav, you should go ahead and you should wash from that water. And take yourself out from a suffix. Why should you deal with a suffix? Says the Mishnah Berurah is cutting it out. This goes back on the entire sif. All of these cases, you have a suffix. If the water is ma'im shenaseh malacha, if you have other water available, use other water. You have a suffix if you have the shear in this ma'im, so don't use it. Fill up another keli where you know that you have the shear, etc., etc. Va'atam, and the rationale is very simple, says the Mishnah Berurah. Because if you have a very easy way to avoid the suffix, why shouldn't you go ahead and avoid the suffix? Ice cotton and bays, the Mishnah Berurah says, the Mechaber says, yital yadav, you should go wash. In the Beis Yosef, it is implied that it's not only that if it's easy for you, if you have, like I said, if you have the faucet right there, you could turn on the faucet and get new water, you should do that. No, it's mashma from the Beis Yosef that you should go look after other water. Don't just say, oh, I remember learning in the Dirshu, I remember learning the Mechaber that says that when it comes to a suffix of Netillas Yadayim, I could use the water misafik, so I'm not going to bother trying to get other water. No, in the Beis Yosef, it's mashma that you should try to go ahead and get other water. And the Mishnah Berurah says, because remember, if you don't wash the Netillas Yadayim properly, kasha la'anius, that could bring chas v'chalila poverty. Nobody wants to suffer the nisyanis of poverty. So, you know what? You have a suffix, go ahead and try to get other water so that you could be yoytze Netillas Yadayim properly. Ois cotton and gimel, v'yoytzi atzmai. The Mechaber said this is what you should do. V'yoytzi atzmai min ha-suffix. Take yourself away from the suffix. Now the Mishnah Berurah brings out an interesting case. He says, how about this? V'im yoydeya shenatal kahalacha. Let's say the suffix is a different kind of suffix. Let's say you know that you washed Netillas Yadayim properly. You had a proper keli, you had proper, clean, unused water, you had a proper shear, everything was fine. You know that you washed a perfectly good Netillas Yadayim. V'achakach, and then after you washed Netillas Yadayim, noilad bahen suffix. After you washed Netillas Yadayim, a suffix arose, bahen, in them. What's the object of the word bahen here in the Mishnah Berurah? On your hands. So you washed a perfectly good Netillas Yadayim, and you went down, you made a hamaitzi on bread, you're eating your suda, and now a suffix arose on the status of your hands now. Says the Mishnah Berurah, kigoyin, for example, shenistapik bahen im hisiach daitoyim lav. We know that stam yadayim are shniyos l'tuma. Stam yadayim, unwashed hands, are considered shniyos l'tuma, and that's why you have to wash the Netillas Yadayim for a suda. Now you washed your hands. Now your hands are no longer stam yadayim. Now your hands are washed hands. Washed hands are tahor. How long do they remain tahor? Well, really, you're not supposed to be mesiach das from your hands. Meaning, you go ahead and you wash the Netillas Yadayim. Now you're supposed to have in mind to protect the tahara of your hands. Meaning that you don't touch a makam atinoifis, you don't touch an unclean part of the body, you don't touch a part of the body that's a makam b'chusa, a part of the body that's always covered. You have in mind to maintain the cleanliness of your hands. But what if you're mesiach das? What if you completely forget about the cleanliness of your hands? Then really you have to wash a new Netillas Yadayim. So says the Mishnah Berurah, what happens if you washed Netillas Yadayim and now you have a suffix whether or not you were mesiach das from your hands? You say, I don't know, was I really protecting the tahara of my hands? I don't know that I was. So now you have a suffix, maybe I need a new Netillas Yadayim. Or, says the Mishnah Berurah, Or maybe you know that you are not mesiach das from your hands. But you do know that you went to scratch yourself, or you were touching around something on your body, and you got close to a makam atinoifis. You got close to an area that's usually covered. And you're not sure. Did you touch an unclean place or did you not? You have a suffix. I don't know. I don't know exactly where my fingers went. In those cases, says the Mishnah Berurah, Ein tzarich lachzar v'litlan. You do not have to go wash your hands again. Afilu latzeis yidei suffix. And you shouldn't even be machmir and say, well, the Mechaber said over here that by a suffix, yesh bi sha'imish im kol zaysim yesh l'mar mechem yitel yad v'yoytzi asmem and a suffix. So maybe if I have a suffix on the status of my hands, maybe the same phrase of the Mechaber kicks in, and maybe it would be proper for me to go wash again, lahoitzi min a suffix. Says the Mishnah Berurah, no. Ein tzarich lazav litlan, afilu lasis yidei suffix. Why? Because we know that in halacha, one of the great arbiters of a suffix, one of the ways we determine a suffix is with the application of chazaka. Once you wash the Netillas Yadayim, your hands now have a cheskas tahara. The chazaka that they have is that they're tar, unless something comes to break the chazaka and make us say that now they're tummy again. If you have a suffix, we apply the chazaka. The chazaka is that they're tar, so they're still tar. What's hayoytze midvarenu? You don't have to be OCD about the tahara of your hands. Oh, maybe I touched something, maybe I didn't, maybe I should go wash again. No. You wash the Netillas Yadayim, your hands are tar. Unless something happens that makes you know that your hands are no longer tar. If you got up from the suda and you went and you used the Beis HaKisei, so now you know you have a problem with your hands. But stam, you're sitting by the table and you're schmoozing and a suffix arose, you're maimed the Yadayim on the chazaka, and you don't need a new Netillas Yadayim. Now we have a very interesting halacha here in the Ramah that I think would take a lot of people by surprise. Says the Ramah, 4 lines down, Nundal Amud Aleph, Haga. Mi shaloi natal yadav. Somebody who did not yet wash the Netillas Yadayim. So you have a person who has stam yadayim. Stam yadayim are tameim, dishnias l'tama. He has to wash the Netillas Yadayim first if he wants to be kavesi with alapas. Mishaloi natal yadav. You have somebody who did not yet wash. V'noga b'mayim, and he touches the Netillas Yadayim water. So this is a very, very simple scenario. You're getting ready to wash for the Suda. You went over to the sink and you filled up a keli. Now you put the keli down and you're rolling up your sleeves, and somebody comes and somehow his unwashed hands get dipped into the Netillas Yadayim cup. Do you have to go pour out the water and get new water? Now, the logic for that would seem to be simple. The water was touched by somebody with unclean hands. So you would think that the unclean hands, the unwashed hands, would transmit tumah to the water, and now the water is no longer usable for the Netillas Yadayim. So if you saw somebody go ahead and pour that water out and pour himself new water, most people, I think, would not have such a kasha. They would say, oh, okay, yeah, I guess somebody with unwashed hands touched the water, so now the water is tummy, and now we need new water. I think that would be the knee-jerk reaction of a lot of people. Says the Ramah, no. If somebody did not yet wash the Netillas Yadayim, then naga b'mayim, and he touches the Netillas Yadayim water that's in a keli, that does not passel the water in the keli for the Netillas Yadayim. That water could still be used for the Netillas Yadayim. V'loy mikru bayim tameim. That water is not called tamei water. Aval aser lirchaytz yadav. However, you're not allowed to wash the Netillas Yadayim. Mimayim shenotal behem chaverei kvar. Using water that somebody else already used for the Netillas Yadayim. So let's just review this Ramah over here. 2 very different cases. The first case is as follows. Like I told you, somebody filled up the keli for the Netillas Yadayim. He put it down for a second. He's rolling up his sleeves. and then somebody else came along, or maybe he himself, accidentally touched the water in the Netillas Yadayim cup. Could you use that water still for Netillas Yadayim? Yes, you can. Even though you touched the water with your hands that are tameh, you did not make the mayim in the keli tameh. And you could go ahead and you could use it for Netillas Yadayim. That's scenario number one. Now scenario number two. You're by a fancy chasana, or you're by a yeshiva dinner in a hotel, where there's a hotel ballroom and they don't have washing stations. It's not like you go to a hall in Lakewood or in Borough Park and in the ballroom they have a row of sinks because they know that everybody has to wash the Netillas Yadayim. This is a ballroom in a Hilton and there's no washing station. So what do? They go outside, they put up tables, and they put up these big, they almost look like hot water urns. They put up these big kalim full of water with a spigot on the bottom, and they have a washing cup. But where do you wash into? So they usually put a basin. So what you do is you fill up the cup, you wash into the basin. Okay, so one person washes into the basin, second person, the third person, the 10th person, the 20th person. Now what's happening is the keli that's holding the Netillas Yadayim water is getting empty, and the basin is getting full. So a well-meaning employee of the hotel comes along, and he has to refill the water, the Netillas Yadayim water. He says to himself, what? I should go take the thing and schlep it over to the bathroom or to the sink, and I should fill it up and bring it back? I have a basin of water right here, and it's really clean water. People just poured it over their hands. They didn't wash their hands with it. I'll take that water, and I'll pour it back in, and we'll use the water over again. That water you cannot use. That water was already used for Netillas Yadayim. Since that water was already used for Netillas Yadayim, that's mayim tmeim. And that water you're not allowed to use. In the first case, even though you touched the water with your unwashed hands, it's not called mayim tmeim. In the second case, where the water was actually used for the Netillas Yadayim, then it's considered mayim tmeim, and you're not allowed to use it anymore for the Netillas Yadayim. Now, I'll give you a heads up for the Mishnah Berurah. In the second case, there's an additional problem. The additional problem of the second case is that since you washed Netillas Yadayim once with that water, it's considered mayim shenasa behem malacha. A task was performed with that water. You washed Netillas Yadayim with that water. Now it's mayim shayfchen. So there's two problems with the water in the second scenario. In the first scenario, there's no problem. Now, we're going to have to explain why is it that in the first case, where you touched the water in the Netillas Yadayim cup with your hands that are tameh, why doesn't the water become tameh? In the second case, it does become tameh. Now, in both cases, the water came into contact with unclean hands. So why is it that in the second case, the water becomes tameh, and in the first case, it does not become tameh? So that we'll have to see in the Mishnah Berurah. But again, just reading the Ramah inside, 4 lines down, Hagah. Mi shaloi nata yadav, if somebody did not yet wash his hands, v'naga b'mayim, and he touches the Netillas Yadayim water, loi nifsaloi san mayim l'netila, that water does not become possible for the Netillas Yadayim, v'loi mikru mayim tmeim, and that water is not called tameh water. Aval aser l'irchatz yadav mimayim shenata b'hem chaver kvar. However, it is aser to use the Netillas Yadayim water that was already used by somebody for the Netillas Yadayim. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut nun daled. Loi nifsalu. If you touch the Netillas Yadayim water in a keli, the water does not become possible for the Netillas Yadayim. Says the Mishnah Berurah, the truth is that we saw a precedent for this halacha all the way in the beginning of this Siman in Sif Beis. Ukamai b'Sif Beis b'nachtaim, when we spoke about the baker. We had a case earlier in Sif Beis where we spoke about a baker who puts his hands in the water in order to, I think it was in order to, well, it was to, you know what, instead of questioning, let's just take a quick look. We said, yeah, let's say the baker dunks his hands into the water so that he could take his wet hands and he could smear water on top of the dough in order to glisten the dough. So The water that's remaining in the keli is not mayim shenase b'malacha. The water on his hands was mayim shenase b'malacha. He used that water to glisten the dough, but the water in the keli he didn't use. So the water in the keli is not mayim shenase b'malacha. The Mechaber told us that water that remains in the keli could still be used for the Netillas Yadayim. Why? The nachtaim, the baker touched that water with unwashed hands. So you see a precedent already in Sif Beis that if you touch water in a keli with unwashed hands, you do not make that water tameh. And that's what the Mishnah Berurah is saying over here. The Mishnah Berurah is saying over here, u'kamay b'Sif Beis b'nachtaim, where you see that touching the water with unclean hands doesn't make it tameh. Now the Mechaber says, even though I'll show you another precedent from later that we did not learn yet, where you see that touching water with unclean hands does make water tameh. What's that case? Even though in a case where you wash one hand, so you took a keli, you poured water onto your right hand. So now your right hand is wet. Now your right hand, you just washed. But your left hand, you didn't wash yet. Now you take your wet right hand and you touch your left hand. Guess what? The halacha is that the unwashed left hand makes the mayim on the right hand tameh. And now both hands are going to need new netila. So you see in that case that the unwashed left hand made the water on the right hand tameh. So here we seem to have a precedent for the idea that touching water with an unclean hand does transmit tumah to the mayim. So again, the Ramah tells us over here that if you touch water in a keli with unwashed hands, the water does not become tameh, and you can use that water for the Netillas Yadayim. We have one precedent in the beginning of our Siman in Kuf Samach that shows us the same halacha. A baker dunked his hands into a keli of water in order to take his wet hands and glisten the dough. The water in the keli is not puzzle for the Netillas Yadayim. Why? He touched it with unclean hands. No, it doesn't become tameh. So that jives with the halacha that we're learning over here in Sif Yad Aleph. But then we have another halacha later on that doesn't jive with this halacha. And that is, if somebody washes one hand and it's still wet, and then he touches his other hand to that hand, his unclean second hand makes the water on the first hand tameh. So it does transmit tumah to the water. So explains the Mishnah Berurah like this. Even though in the case where somebody washed one hand, and then he touched it to another hand, the remnant water on the first hand becomes tameh, like we're going to see here at Hashem later on in Siman Kuf Samach Beisiv Dalid, mayim shebekli lo nitmu b'nigasa behem. That halakha does not apply to water that's in a keli. In the case of Kuf Samach Beis, the water's not in a keli. The water is wetness that's remaining on the first hand that you washed. In that case, the second hand could make that water tameh. But water in a keli, you filled up a Netillas Yadayim cup, and it's ready to be used for the Netillas Yadayim, and you touched it with an unwashed hand, that water does not become tameh by virtue of you touching it. Now, before I explain why this is the case, let's go weiter in the Mishnah Berurah, where the Mishnah Berurah is going to tell us a halacha that comes out of this. Says the Mishnah Berurah, therefore, based on this halacha, hayoytze mi beis hakisei. Somebody comes out from the beis hakisei, ubal lital yadav, and he has to wash his hands. Now, nowadays, you come out of the beis hakisei, you go to a sink, you turn on the faucet, you wash your hands. Back in the day, they didn't have indoor running water and plumbing everywhere. So what did they have at the beis hakisei? They had a pail. They had a bucket full of water. So you come out of the beis hakisei, and now you have to wash your hands. Says the Mishnah Berurah, hayoytze mi beis hakisei ubal lital yadav. Somebody came out of the beis hakisei, and he has to wash his hands. Yachal lishayiv b'chafdav min hadli. What he could do is he could take the palms of his hands and he could scoop up water out of the bucket, right? So you have a bucket full of water. He could scoop up water from the bucket, take it out of the bucket, wash his hands, and pour the water down onto the floor, away from the bucket. He could draw water out of the bucket using the palms of his hands. That's chafnav. And then pour the water out of the bucket. And the rest of the water that remains in the bucket does not become tameh from the fact that this person touched it with his unwashed hands. And the rest of the water in the bucket is kosher for the Netillas Yadayim, for somebody who has to wash to eat his tuna fish sandwich. So Ruvain you have a bucket of water. Ruvain came out of the Beis HaKisei. He stuck his hands into the bucket. Those hands, not only they're unwashed hands, they're unwashed hands of a person who just came out of the Beis HaKisei. Those hands are definitely not clean. They're definitely not tahor. He dunked his hands into the bucket. He took out water. He went out, he rubbed his hands, and he poured the water onto the floor. Guess what? The water that remains in the bucket is kosher for the Netillas Yadayim. It didn't become mayim tmeim by virtue of the fact that this individual went ahead and touched the water. Now, the Mishnah Berurah says, but we have to be careful how far we take this halacha. But let's say that's not what the person does. What he does is he comes out of the Beis HaKisei. He doesn't stick his hands into the bucket to take water out. What he does is he immerses his hands in the water and he washes his hands in the bucket. He doesn't scoop out water and wash his hands outside of the bucket. He sticks his hands in the bucket and he washes his hands in the bucket. Oh, that's different, says the Mishnah Berurah. If he washes his hands in the bucket itself, litaron, in order to cleanse the hands, then all the water in the bucket becomes mayim shenase behem malacha, because you washed your hands in the bucket of water. Upsulim l'netila, and now all of that water is possible for the Netillas Yadayim. And this is true even if your hands weren't really dirty. Nevertheless, since the bottom line is you had a need to wash your hands because you touched an unclean part of your body, that mayim is now wastewater because you did malacha with it. Okay, so let's wrap up over here. We have a Ramah. The first halakha that the Ramah told me is, if somebody fills up a washing cup, and now either he or somebody else touches the water in the washing cup with his unwashed hands, that mayim does not become mayim tmeim. That water is still kosher for the Netillas Yadayim. The Mishnah Berurah compared this to the case at the beginning of the Siman in Sif Beis, to the baker who stunked his unclean hands. When I say unclean, I mean they're not tahor, they're stam yadayim, they're unwashed hands. He immersed his hands into a bucket of water to take out water to glisten dough. And we said the rest of the water in the keli is still available for Netillas Yadayim. Why? It's not mayim shenase ben malacha, and it doesn't become tameh. Very good. But we saw another halacha, where if somebody has two unwashed hands, he washes one hand, so his right hand is now clean, but it's wet. Now he touches the right hand with his unclean left hand. The water on his right hand becomes tameh. Why? How did it become tameh? You just told me that if I touch water with unclean hands, it doesn't become tameh. So how did this water become tameh? Explains to Mishnah Berurah the difference is, in our case and in the case of the baker, the water is in a keli. Water that's in a keli does not become tameh if somebody touches it with unclean hands. If he washes his hands in it, it becomes possible for the Netillas Yadayim because it's mayim shenase ben malacha. But if he just touches the water in the keli, that water doesn't become tameh. In the case of Kuf Samach Beis, the water that's on the first hand that was washed is not in the keli. You touch water with the unclean hands, water that's not in a keli, it becomes tameh. But water that's in a keli does not become tameh if you touch it with unwashed hands. Why not? The Mefarshim explain, because the water that's in the keli has a din of a mikveh. When you have water in a keli ready for the Netillas Yadayim, that's water that is prepared and is usable for the Netillas Yadayim to bring about Taharas Yadayim. So that water has a din of a mikveh. Now, if somebody's tameh and he goes into the mikveh, does the water in the mikveh become tameh? No. It takes off the tumah off of his guf, but it doesn't get transferred to the mikveh. The mikveh causes tahara. The mikveh gives tahara to the person, and it removes the tumah. The tumah's puff. The tumah's gone. It doesn't remain in the water. So too, when you have mayim in a keli, if you touch the mayim with an unwashed hand, that water is like mikveh water. It does not become tameh. But water that's out of a keli could become tameh. Very interesting. Okay, now, we're up to Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Nun Hey. So the second halacha that the Ramah told me was, while it's true that if you touch the water in the keli, it doesn't become tameh, even though you had unwashed hands, you cannot wash the Netillas Yadayim with water that was already used for the Netillas Yadayim. If Ruvain washed with water and now that water is in a basin, you can't reuse that water and use it again for the Netillas Yadayim. Says the Mishnah Berurah, why? Because that water became tameh. That water, when you poured it from the keli onto the hands to remove the tumah from the hands, now that water picks up the tumah from the hands. Va'od, and another reason why you can't do this is shenasa behem malacha, because by virtue of the fact that the first person already washed the Netillas Yadayim using that water, that means he did malacha with that water. He performed a task with that water. V'lachein, and therefore, since there are two reasons for this, afiluim natal me revius babas achas, even if the water that was already used for the Netillas Yadayim was a revius of water or more that was poured over tamei hands bebas achas, gam kein aser. What does the Mishnah Berurah mean? What the Mishnah Berurah means is like this. I just told you that the reason water in a keli doesn't pick up tumah is because the water in the keli has a din like a mikveh. And the same way a mikveh does not pick up tumah from a person when he goes to be tovel in a mikveh, the mayim that's in the keli that's prepared for taharas yodayim also does not pick up tumah if somebody touches it with stam yodayim. Now, that comparison is a very good comparison to when you wash the Netillas Yadayim with a revius or more. So, to put that in perspective, we've already discussed a halacha several times where we saw that by Netillas Yadayim there's mayim rishonim and there's mayim achronim. What does that mean? You know that when you go to wash for a suda, you pour water over your hands twice. Why? Because the halacha is that when you pour water the first time over your hand, it takes the tumah off the hand, but the tumah goes into the water. So now you have a hand that's tahar, but it has remnants, it has remaining tameh water on it. Now when you pour the second time, the second pour takes off the tameh water off the hand. We're going to see a halacha that really, if the first time you pour water over the hand, you pour a volume of at least a revius in one pour, then really you don't need a second pour, because the revius of water is mamish like a mikveh. So when you pour a revius of water over the hand, the water doesn't pick up tumah. The tumah comes off the hand, but it goes puff, and it doesn't get picked up into the water. It doesn't transmit to the water. Over here, says the Mishnah Berurah, since the bottom line is there are two reasons why you cannot reuse Netillas Yadayim water. Reason number one is because it picked up tumah. Reason number two is because it's mayim shenasa behem halacha. Since there are two reasons, this halacha applies even if you wash Netillas Yadayim with a revius or more bebas achas. In that case, the first reason doesn't seem to apply because the water doesn't pick up tumah. The tumah goes puff. The tumah is gone. So why can't you reuse the water? You can't reuse the water because it's mayim shenase behem malacha. Wow. So my steady listeners will know how bad I am at estimating how much we're going to cover in a shiur. So I thought that, we're going to finish the Dalet Amud Aleph. We're going to do the Dalet Amud Beis. Let's see if we finish the Dalet Amud Aleph. We have some more time. Let's go to Sif Yud Beis. 4 lines up from the bottom, a little bit past the middle of the line. Going back to discussing what kind of water, what kind of things are kosher for the Netillas Yadayim and what's possible for the Netillas Yadayim. Says the Mechaber, Hashelig, snow, V'habarod, hail, V'hakfor, sleet, V'haglid, ice. Pirush, the Ramah says, what's glid? Hamayim anikbim meroiv hakoyer, water that's solidified from the cold. V'hamelach, and salt. Now, exactly what melach means over here is a source of discussion. We'll see what the Mishnah Berurah says, and we'll take it from there. But for now, I'm just going to translate melach literally, salt. What's the halacha of all of these things? Im riskon ad shenasu mayim. If you chopped them up, you ground them up until they turned into water, they liquefied, noitlin mehem, then you could use them for the Netillas Yadayim from a keli. Okay, so you have snow, right? You went skiing. You went to Hunter Mountain on a skiing trip. You went to Vermont on a skiing trip. It's lunchtime. You have a tuna fish sandwich. You need to wash the Netillas Yadayim. Everybody forgot to bring water, and the lodge is very far away. But there's snow all over the place. So somebody says, hey, why can't we wash the Netillas Yadayim from snow? Says the Mechaber, you could scoop up snow, but you need to liquefy the snow. So somehow you got to chop up the snow until it's liquefied, and then you could use it for the Netillas Yadayim. Sleet, hail, if you could liquefy them, so then essentially they're water. Ice, you can't wash the Netillas Yadayim with ice. You can't take a chunk of ice and rub it on your hands and say it's the Netillas Yadayim. No, but you could grind up the ice and liquefy it, and then it's water. What is it? It's water. And then you can wash the Netillas Yadayim. Now the odd man out over here is melach. Salt. Exactly how you liquefy salt, I'm not sure. I never tried to take salt, put it into a food processor, and leave it in there at high speed for long enough to see what happens. But we did learn originally that, melach is one of the things that are tchilasayim in amayim. It's, sea salt is tchilasayim in amayim, right? You go to the beach, you scoop up a Netillas Yadayim cup full of water, guess what? There's salt in there. You can't see it until you evaporate it out, but there's salt in there. So salt is tchilasayim and amayim. So again, that's why salt is mentioned over here in Sif Yud Beis. We're going to have to understand, according to the Mishnah Berurah, it seems very clear that melach over here does not mean salt. Melach means mei melach. It means salty water. Now let's remember that we already discussed salty water in Sif Tes. In Sif Tes, the Mechaber told us, mayim meluchim, right? Salt water, if it's so salty that it's not roy l'shtiyas kelev, you can't use it for the Netillas Yadayim. So if Yud Beis, Sif Yud Beis, melach is talking about mei melach, then we're going to have to reconcile it with Sif Tes, because Sif Tes says very clearly, mayim meluchim. And over there it says that mayim meluchim, it depends. If it's not roy l'shtilas kelev, you can't use it. But if it is roy l'shtilas kelev, then you could use it. So, let's see. All right. So again, says the Mechaber in Sif Yud Beis, Hashelek, snow, v'abarad, hail, v'akfar, sleet, v'aglid, ice, pir shamayim v'nikve b'rav akar, v'amelach, which we're translating right now as salt. Im riskan achanasu mayim, if you ground them up until they're liquefied and they become mayim, noitlin mayim, you could use them for the Netillas Yadayim. V'toivlin bahem, and you could use all of these things for tvilas Yadayim without grinding them up. V'toivlin bahem, you could immerse your hands in them and use them for tvilas Yadayim im yesh bahem kishir, if you have the proper shear, if you have enough salt, sleet, ice. So we'll discuss what that means. Okay, Let's see the Mishnah Berurah here. Ois kat nun vav. HaKvar. What's kvar? I translated kvar as sleet. Says the Chavetz Chaim, gishamim, rain, shenikbu b'yiridasan, that solidified while it was falling down. V'hu ke'ein barad, and it's similar to hail. So my understanding is that barad is hail. Barad is nice, firm, solid, hard hail. And this is gishamim shenikvu, this is sleet. Ois kad nun zayin, v'hamelach. The Mechaber said salt. So first of all, jumps in the Mishnah Berurah. The Mishnah Berurah says, wait a second, salt? You're putting melach together with sheleg, barad, kvar, and glid. And you're telling me that all of these things are usable for Netillas Yadayim from a keli as long as you liquefied them. Says the Mishnah Berurah, hold it. Lav b'chol gavdi mutter b'melach. Melach is not the same as the other things in this list. You can't always use melach. Because when it comes to the Netillas Yadayim with a keli, in Siftes, the Mechaber said that salt water, now over there he said it's salt water that's not royal l'shtias kelev, but the Mechaber said at Siftes that you cannot use mei melach for Netillas Yadayim. So how are you listing mei melach? And from his kasha, that's how I see very clearly that what the Mishnah Berurah is understanding melach over here as mei melach. It's very clear that that's how he learns this. But basically, this is the kasha that the Mishnah Berurah is asking. The Mishnah Berurah is asking, I don't understand. How could you tell me over here that melach has the same din as sheleg, barad, kvar, and glid, and you could use them for the Netillas Yadayim from a keli as long as they're liquefied? Mei melach is liquefied, and yet in Siftes the Mechaber said that you cannot use mei melach for the Netillas Yadayim. So again, says the Mishnah Berurah, lav b'chol gavdi mutter b'melach. You can't always use mei melach for the Netillas Yadayim from a keli. Because in Siftes the Mechaber told me you cannot use mei melach for the Netillas Yadayim from a kli. Af b'mayim aluchim. V'rak b'tfila b'soichan mutter kishiyesh ben sher mikvah. And it's only kosher for Tfilas Yadayim. Umishum degamel Tfilas aguf ksherin. And the reason why is because it's similar to the din of Tfilas aguf. And you could use mei melach for Tfilas aguf. So you could also use it for Tfilas Yadayim. So the Mishnah Berurah's teretz is a doichik. The Mishnah Berurah says, Umipnei dechal elu shnuyim yachad l'inyan mikvah. The Mishnah Berurah says what you're forced to say is that the Mechaber put melach over here together with sheleg, barad, kfar, and glid only because it has the same halacha that is usable for Tfilas Yadayim. So kilolon gam kan after einam shavim b'dinam legamri, even though they don't mamish have the same din. So again, why is it listed together? Because mei melach has the same din as these other items, that if you liquefy them, they're kosher for Tfilas Yadayim. But for the Netillas Yadayim from a keli, says the Mishnah Berurah, no. You can't say that it's usable for the Netillas Yadayim from a keli because it's Siftes the Mechaber said it's not usable for the Netillas Yadayim from a keli. Now this Mishnah Berurah is really coming from Rabbi Kiva Eger. That's where this Mishnah Berurah is coming from. There are others that have different tirutzim to this. The Pri Chadash makes a different chilik between Siftes and Sif Yud Beis. He makes a very interesting chilik to Pri Chadash. The Pri Chadash wants to say that in Siftes, when the Mechaber said you cannot use mayim meluchim, over there he was talking about mayim misukim, fresh water, that you added salt to. Oh, if you take perfectly good fresh water and you add salt to it, now it's not royal l'shtias kelev. Now you took off the teres mayim. Now it's not considered mayim anymore, and you can't use it for the Netillas Yadayim. Over here in Sif Yud Beis, the Mechaber is talking about natural salt water. Natural salt water, it has teres mayim. I mean, isn't the ocean full of water? Right? Don't people go to the beach and say, wow, the water is so beautiful? They don't go to the beach and say, wow, the salt is so beautiful. The salt water is so beautiful. The water is so beautiful. So the Pri Chadash says natural salt water is not a problem. You could use that for Netillas Yadayim. Then there are others that want to say that over here in Sif Yud Beis, the Mechaber is not talking about Mei Melech at all. Over here in Sif Yud Beis, the Mechaber is talking about salt. You went ahead and you liquefied salt. If you liquefy salt, so then you could use it. If it's as long as it's liquefied, you could go ahead and you could use it. Okay. All right, let's do one more Mishnah Berurah over here. Ice cut numches im riskan. These things could be used if they're ground up. Ava balavach, if they're not liquefied, ein noitl mem bekli. You can't use them from a keli. You can't take snow and pour snow out of a keli for the Netillas Yadayim. It's not a liquid. Ava lit balay yadayim b'soichan, but to immerse your hands in snow, or to immerse your hands in hail or sleet. Im yesh ben kisher mikvah, if you have the share of a mikvah, mutter b'shasat chak, kishein loy mayim, afilu b'loy riskan. That's mutter b'shasat chak if you have no other water, even if you don't grind it up. Now, says the Mishnah Berurah, an interesting thing. We know, we had a machlokes earlier, when you want to dunk your hands and do Tevilas Yadayim, do you need the share of memsa? Do you need 40 sa, the traditional minimum share of a mikvah? Or could you do Tevilas Yadayim as long as you have enough water to cover both of your hands at one time? And we explained that the machlokes, we had two different sheets that the Mechaber brought down. We explained that the chilik is, the difference between these two opinions is, do we look at it and say that for Tevilas Yadayim you need a share mikvah, for tahara, for taharas haguf, which is memsa, or do we compare it to Tevilas Kalim? By Tevilas Kalim, the halacha is, if you have a tiny keli, you have a shot glass, you could be tovel a shot glass, you don't need memsa. You just need enough water to cover the shot glass. So too by Tevilas Yadayim. Maybe you just need enough water to cover both hands at one time. We had two different opinions. Over here, the Mishnah Berurah says that the Mechaber says, if you want to use snow or sleet for Tevilas Yadayim, you need to have a sheer mikvah. So, says the Mishnah Berurah like this, you need to have a sheer mikvah, says the Mishnah Berurah. Va'afilu im eina shelig mechunas harbe bebasachas. What if it snowed a half an inch? So there's a half an inch of water on the ground. And in no one place on the ground is there a depression in the ground where you have 40 saw of snow. No, you've got a nice, flat, smooth half inch of snow covering a whole large area. It's very, very low. Maybe it's not even a half an inch. Maybe it's a quarter of an inch of snow over a vast area. The Mechaber says you need a share mikvah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, it's apparent from this Mishnah Berurah that, first of all, you need 40 sa. Now, we're going to have to explain. Over here, the Mishnah Berurah is saying that the Mechaber says you need 40 sa, even though the Mechaber had earlier those two shittas. We had a machlokes if you need 40 sa or not. Over here, the Mishnah Berurah is assuming you need 40 sa. Why is he making that assumption? But he's assuming that you need 40 sa. But says the Mishnah Berurah, an interesting thing. 40 sa doesn't mean that you need a depression that has 40 sa of snow in it. No. You have a huge parking lot, and there's a quarter of an inch of snow covering the whole parking lot. There's definitely 40 sa of snow here. It's not all mechunas b'makom echad. It's not all held in a small, in a relatively small ditch. It's spread out over the whole parking lot. Says the Mishnah Berurah, that's called 40 sa because it's all connected. So it's 40 sa. No problem. You have 40 sa. Kol sheyesh arba'im sa mechuber yachad. As long as you have 40 sa of snow that's connected, toivlin by, you can immerse your hands and use it for Tevilas Yadayim. Nevertheless, but you do have to have enough snow that when you push your hand into the snow, your hand is going to get covered. So you'll tell me there's only an eighth of an inch of snow, but it's 2 football fields. So I definitely have 40 saw snow here. Yeah, but you can't do Netillas Yadayim because just like by Netillas Kalim, you need enough water that you could stick the shot glass in and cover the shot glass. You want to rely on this. You want to be tovel your hands. You got to be able to tovel your hands. You got to be able to immerse your hands. If you're going to go like this, you're going to put your hand down once this way and then flip it over and put your hand down that way. That's the Netillas Yadayim l'chatzayin. You're trying to do half a hand at a time, which we said doesn't work. So you can't do that by Netillas Yadayim. So says the Mishnah Berurah, you definitely need enough snow. It has to be deep enough that you could stick your hand in and cover your hand. Now, as far as why the Mishnah Berurah assumes that you need memsa, so what the Mefarshim say is like this. The Mefarshim say, yes, we had 2 sheetas earlier, whether or not for Netillas Yadayim you need memsa. But over here in our case, it's different. Why? Because in our case, we're dealing with a double suffix. First of all, we're being makel, and we're allowing you to do Netillas Yadayim in snow, in hail, in sleet, that's not merusik, that's not ground up, and it's not liquefied. That's one kula. Now you want to use another kula, and you want to not even have memsa, that the Mefarshim say you can't do. You have to have memsa, you're going to have. All right? I was very optimistic, and I thought that we would get a lot further than this. It wasn't to be. I'm not going to embark on the next part of Sif Yud Beis because it's a whole new sugya. So we're going to stop over here. 2 lines to the bottom, middle of the line, before the words of Yesh Bi Sha'omer. Thank you for joining me for limud HaTorah. Discuss of limud HaTorah should be Megan against Klal Yisrael. The Rosh should send Yeshuas, Refuas, Parnasa, Shidduchim to all those in need. We should be Zaycha to see not a partial Geula and not a partial Yeshua. We should be Zaycha to see the Bias Gal Tzedek, Memherav Yameinu, with a Geula Shlema. Be well.